everyone. Welcome to this BISA lunchtime seminar. I'm David Feldman. I'm the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. And this seminar on anti-Jewish racism and violence after the 7th of October and before is part of our series on anti-Semitism now. Let me just say a very few words of introduction. The attack carried out by Hamas and others on October the 7th, and the response by the IDF in the week since, have not only accounted for thousands of lives, but have also been hugely divisive around the world. We've seen a rise in anti-Semitism and an unprecedented mobilization of Jewish people against anti-Semitism, not least in the UK. We have seen renewed controversy over how to define and recognize anti-Semitism, including controversy among Jews. We've seen controversy over the relationship between anti-Semitism and the signs, slogans, and program of movements that proclaim their solidarity with Palestinians. And underpinning much of this are disagreements over the relationship between anti-Zionism, however that is defined, and anti-Semitism. And then there are other questions which often lie implicit within public debates. How do events today relate to the past, to past history on the ground and past controversies? Is it more of the same, or does the scale of the slaughter on and since October the 7th and the dimensions of the controversy since then mean that something fundamental has changed? This is all too much to deal with in one seminar, and here at BISA we shall return to these questions and themes. But I'm very pleased that we can make a start today. The issues we deal with are emotive and divisive, but this is an academic seminar, and as such represents the values of the university, this university. These values don't make the topic less divisive and less emotive, but they do prescribe a set of rules concerning civility and respect to which we all adhere, and which allows this space to operate as one that permits debate and exchange. So please do remain muted during the presentations, and then after that there'll be plenty of time for a Q&A and for discussion, and I'll invite you all to raise your virtual hand if you want to make a question or raise a point. Make a point. I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers today. Our first speaker will be Camila Bassi, who will, Camila is senior lecturer in human geography at Sheffield Hallam University. Her research interests are in the geographies of race, ethnicity, and sexuality, and Marxist geographies. She's published academic critiques of the revolutionary left vanguard of England's anti-war movement and on the historical U-turns in the Marxist politics of the Palestine-Israeli conflict. Her book, Outcast: How Jews Were Banished from the Anti-Racist Imagination, published earlier this year, was awarded the best book on contemporary anti-Semitism by the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. The title of Camila's talk is Decolonization is Not a Metaphor in the Wake of the 7th of October. Decolonization is not a metaphor in inverted commas in the wake of the 7th of October. She'll be followed by Yair Wallach. Yair is Reader in Israel Studies at SOAS in the University of London, where he's the head of the SOAS Center for Jewish Studies. He's a social and cultural historian of modern Palestine, Israel, studying Jews and Palestinians in a relational manner. His most recent book is A City in Fragments, which was published to great acclaim in 2020. He has written on Israel-Palestine and on anti-Semitism for The Guardian, for Haaretz, the New Statesman, and others. And Yair will talk to how to understand anti-Jewish violence, rethinking moments of Zionist, anti-Zionist controversy from 1891 to 2023. And that's quite enough from me. And so without any further ado, please, Camila, we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm just gonna, I think I've managed to successfully screen share. So my sincere thanks to BISA for inviting me here today to have this opportunity to talk to you. So as David said, the title of my presentation, which is going to last about 15 minutes, is Decolonization is Not a Metaphor in the Wake of the 7th of October. We are told by Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang, the authors of a landmark paper in post-colonial studies, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, that decolonization is meant to be unsettling, since its primary task is to reinvade and repatriate stolen land. To reinvade and repatriate stolen indigenous land and life. So it's not a metaphor for other general improvements in education and society. On the 7th of October, for some academics, this fantasy politics came alive and decolonization is not a metaphor became a mantra. It became a mantra to celebrate the reinvasion of indigenous land and a mantra to chastise any academic who had previously subscribed to decolonization work and yet had stayed silent on this day. The state of much, not all, but much of the academic left on the horrific atrocities committed by Hamas, a violence in which anti-Semitism was an ideological component, was either public endorsement or private ambivalence and public silence. I think it is both necessary and revealing to examine Tuck and Yang's paper to grasp its significance as a racialized identity politics of resentment, rage, and revenge, and its compatibility with the Jewish question, that is, with the racist idea that something must be done to redress the harms that Jews inflict on humanity. In the wake of the 7th of October, decolonization is not a metaphor has unleashed a pre-existing ideological tendency to reduce Israel proper to a live settler colony, and thus as the world's only illegitimate nation state that can and must be undone, and to conflate all Israeli Jews into a settler camp who, without fully relinquishing their land from the river to the sea, are damned and doomed as lesser human beings and cannot belong to the universal human collective. In Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, the paper, the battle line of settler colonialism is clearly demarcated. Settlers have stolen the land of indigenous people. Settler colonialism represents the totality of the ills of colonialism more generally. With no spatial distance between metropole and colony, it combines external and internal modes of colonization, exploitation, and geopolitical and biopolitical management to ensure, I quote, the ascendancy of a nation and its white elite. Significantly, settler occupation of indigenous land is seen as an ongoing structural violence against the native, rather than as a series of intersecting events, forces, and conditions of existence. Vis-a-vis post-colonial analysis of Israel-Palestine then, the events within the years of 1948, 1967, 2001, 7th of October 2023, for example, tend to be framed beyond their specific crisscrossing and interrelated empirical detail, and instead as pre to post moments of an ongoing, relentless process of structural racist destruction, disappearance, and erasure of Palestinians. Perhaps this goes some way to explaining why, in the International Critical Geographies Group, the Palestine Statement, signed by over 1,000 of my geography colleagues, the 7th of October is discussed as a pre to post moment that escalated the violence against the Palestinians, with no reference whatsoever to the slaughters, rapes and hostage taking of Israeli civilians by Hamas. As for the public cheer of some leftist academics on the 7th of October, including some who signed this statement, the images of literal reinvasion fit the script. As one tweet says here, people who illegally evaded a country and dispossessed its indigenous population are now fleeing. The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And as Tuck and Yang make plain in their paper from 2012, decolonisation is inextricably tied to resettlement and reinvasion, which is precisely why they say it is necessarily unsettling. There can be no compromise, no reconciliation, no union, no settlement between colonial settler and indigenous native, Tuck and Yang assert, because this takes away from the goal to fully take back stolen land. In post-colonial research, a two-nations, two-state settlement on pre-1967 borders, which would make the Gaza Strip and West Bank part of an independent Palestinian nation state, is generally considered an anathema because it is seen to legitimise the settler colonialism of Israel proper. From the river to the sea, the cry of Hamas is the cry also, in this sense, of decolonisation. Implicit in Tuck and Yang's paper is an inverted racialisation of settlers and indigenous peoples. All settlers are guilty, complicit, and have no future as worthy human beings unless and until they give up their land. Settlers are less than human. This operates through an inversion of their observation that settlers racially dehumanise indigenous people. So they say, in order for settlers to make a place their home, they must destroy and disappear the indigenous people that live there. Indigenous people must be erased, must be made into ghosts. So the implied argument follows for indigenous people to retake their home, they must destroy and disappear the settlers that live there. With this in mind, in the International Critical Geographies group, the Palestine statement, the victims of Hamas are the ghosts. Moreover, we are told that Palestinians have the right to resist, while Israel has no right to self-defense. In this statement, opposition to Israel's century-long crimes of imperialism, settler colonialism, and apartheid is absolute. Opposition to the dehumanization, hatred, and disinformation spread on traditional social media against the Palestinians is absolute. Denial of anti-Semitism, because we are told anti-Semitism is a fabricated weapon used against pro-Palestinian academics and activists. Denial of anti-Semitism is absolute. We reject any and all conflation of criticism of the Israeli state or Zionism with anti-Semitism. Read generously, in an instinct to side with the victims of asymmetric warfare, there appears room for only one perpetrator, and this perpetrator is made into a fantasized monster. In this absolutism, the Jewish question fuses with the narrative of settler colonialism and the goal of decolonization. Something must be done about the ills that Jews deal out to humanity. Decolonization is not a metaphor, is not a paper per se about the history of stolen indigenous land. It is a cry against the settler in toto. More specifically, against the settler touching and tainting decolonization. Tuck and Yang warn, when metaphor invades decolonization, it kills the very possibility of decolonization. It recenters whiteness, it extends innocence to the settler, and it entertains a settler future. Decolonization is not a metaphor, it's about recognizing how the structural racist violence of settler colonialism extends. It extends from the ongoing occupation of indigenous lands to, I quote, settler moves to innocence, which include, I quote, settler nativism, in which settlers claim to have native blood, and a focus on decolonizing the mind, as if, Tuck and Yang deride, it were the sole activity of decolonization to allow conscientization to stand in for the more uncomfortable task of relinquishing stolen land. Beware is Tuck and Yang's message of the white settler dressed in politically progressive garb. Decolonize a verb, and decolonization a noun cannot be easily grafted onto pre-existing discourses or frameworks. even if they are critical, even if they are anti-racist, even if they are justice frameworks. The easy absorption, adoption, and transposing of decolonisation is yet another form of settler appropriation. The politics of decolonisation here is a separatist project that belongs to Indigenous people. Any joint work, any strategic joint work can neither, in their mind, reconcile present grievances nor foreclose future conflict. Tuck and Yang continue. The absorption of decolonisation by settler social justice frameworks is one way the settler, disturbed by her own settler status, tries to escape or contain the unbearable searchlight of complicity, of having harmed others just by being oneself. The desire to reconcile is just as relentless as the desire to disappear the native. It is a desire to not have to deal with this native problem anymore. The settlers once more are essentialised and made into the same monster, from the settler who advances a politics of annihilation to the settler who wishes to reconcile with Indigenous people. Both, it is argued, reflect an innate tendency of the settler to erase the native. Hence it follows either the cheer for the 7th of October or the silence. All Israeli Jews are seen as fair targets. From Netanyahu and his far-right coalition government's eliminationist politics for one greater Israel to the peace and reconciliation efforts of Israeli Jewish leftist activists, because both are seen to reflect different degrees of a genocidal tendency to erase the native. Returning to the International Critical Geographies group, the Palestine Statement, Israeli Jews are absent both as victims of Hamas and as a resistance movement inside Israel. Solidarity is made with everyone but Israeli Jews who oppose the Israeli state violence and war against the Palestinians in Gaza and the settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. As one signatory to this statement remarked on social media, of the young people at the Nova Peace Music Festival attacked by Hamas, sometimes partying on stolen land next to a concentration camp where 1 million people are starved, has consequences. And later, there's no Israeli left, it's just different degradations of genocide. Tuck and Yang's seminal paper is a call for an ethic of incommensurability, an ethic that recognises that settlers and natives are not comparable as people. In contrast to aims to reconciliation, because settlers and natives can never be united as human beings. Reconciliation, they say, is concerned with questions of what will decolonisation look like, what will happen after abolition, what will be the consequences of decolonisation for the settler. Decolonisation is not obliged to answer those questions. Decolonisation is not accountable to settlers or a settler future. Decolonisation is accountable to Indigenous sovereignty and an Indigenous future. What's more, the answers to these questions, they argue, necessitate moves that may feel very unfriendly. Decolonisation is not a metaphor, represents a racialised identity politics of resentment, rage and fantasised revenge, in which monsters are made out of human beings and conflict is not released but is locked in, leading us into a total war with no end and without end, with the fantasy of total victory and the probable reality, the probable tragic reality of total defeat. Decolonisation here reflects a wider anti-racist imagination that gives credence to the notion that race is real, that rarefies race, rather than challenges the social construction of the idea of race and its real-world consequences. It is an anti-racism which does not escape the ideology of racism. Indeed, it is a racialised identity politics that requires its racialised enemy for its own existence. In rarefying race and implying a racial essence, purity and authenticity to both settler and native, both peoples are without independent agency to meet together in the dream and pursuit of freedom. Relegated to a footnote in their paper, yet highly significant, Tuck and Yang state that racism is an invention of colonialism. Furthermore, Tuck and Yang briefly concede that not all settlers are white. Later, they elaborate on this by explaining the colonising trick. presumably of supposedly real white settlers, to quasi-assimilate the immigrant, refugee or migrant, a quasi-assimilation into whiteness which can revert back at any moment. Decolonisation is not a metaphor, understands the world as the export of a European colonial project of white supremacy, and from the context of the United States as a white over black structural racism. However, as Robert Miles reminds us, while colonialism was an integral moment in the history of racism, it was actually the articulation between the capitalist mode of production and the nation state, rather than between capitalism and colonialism, that mapped the primary set of social relations within which racism has had its origins and initial effects. The history of Zionism in this context, the history of Zionism as a nationalist movement and as a colonial settler state project, whose fate was tied to the unprecedented genocidal anti-Semitism of the Holocaust, is erased in favour of an approach to Zionism through the Jewish question. Anti-Semitism is banished as a form of racism, as a racism against the Jews, but it represents as a racist weapon of Zionism and Israel against the Palestinian plight, as a racism of the Jews. Okay, I'm going to stop screen sharing and leave it there and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Camila, for that and for keeping to time. Yair, you're on.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to get the slides on. Okay. These are, this is part of work in progress and research in progress, and it's somewhat intimidating to present these in general to an audience of lots of experts and people I appreciate, and also at the current moment where things are very raw. So please bear with me. Now, I'm focusing here on Jewish Zionism and anti-Zionism and how they understand the relation, how they understand anti-Jewish violence in relation to Palestine. So I'll start with this, and this is 1891. I'm going to look at, broadly speaking, 3 moments. The first of them is 1891, the Blackstone Memorial. As some of you may know, this is what we will call anachronistically a Christian Zionist petition that was presented to the US president, calling the restoration of the Jews to Palestine, organized by a Christian reverend, and got quite a lot of signatories from prominent people. This is 5 years before Herzl and the Jewish state and so forth. So there's no Zionism yet. Now, Blackstone also tried to get Jewish figures and rabbis to sign the petition, and one of them was Rabbi Solomon Schindler from Boston, and he refused to sign, and then he also gave a speech against it in his synagogue, and he published a piece in the Boston Herald in which he says very clearly that American Hebrews, as he says it, should not support this initiative by any means. It's not going to help them. It's a dangerous initiative for them. What's interesting about Schindler's article is that he mentions the dispossession of Palestinians, which he calls Turks, as part of the reasons why this is a bad idea. He says, and I'm quoting just one sentence, "It's absurd to think of robbing a nation of one of its provinces for the purpose of giving it to someone else." And he says, what's going to happen to our Palestinians? Are they just going to be pushed away by some kind of European intervention? This is one element, and it's certainly not the most important element. The main reason in his critique is that the danger is that once there is a Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine, immediately there'll be the cry that the Jew must go. He has now a land of his own, let him return to where he belongs. So the idea here is that the creation of Jewish autonomy, self-rule, sovereignty, the kind of it allows anti-Semites to reverse emancipation and tell the Jews, you don't like it here, why don't you go to Palestine anyway? You should do this anyway. And that's the main danger, even though he does mention the question of Palestinians and what happens to them. This there's a very vitriolic response to Schindler by someone called Aryeh Tzvi Shtor in a Hebrew newspaper that is issued in Baltimore. And he accuses Schindler of being a circumcised anti-Semite, as bad as Haman and Torquemada. And what he was basically saying, the Jews in Russia are drowning in a sea of misery, wrestling with a bitter death. And here comes a Christian guy that kind of suggests his help and suggests to bring back the people of Israel to their land. And this rabbi, German Jewish rabbi, is just kind of trying to prevent it. And this writer perceives it as part of German Jewish hatred of Russian and Polish Jews. So the main question is the misery of Polish and Russian Jews, and any attempt to alleviate this should be welcome. And the question of Palestinians is mentioned here, and he's kind of mocking Schindler for caring about Palestinians. He should be caring more about his own people. What is interesting in this episode is that 5 years before Zionism, we see very similar rhetoric that we see until today about firstly, the Schindler's identifying the kind of risks that the kind of inevitable conflict with Palestinians, and the response is to accuse him of being a self-hating Jew. The second moment I want to allude to is the 1917, the Balfour Declaration, and its two conditions. The Balfour Declaration came with two caveats. One of them is more well-known than the other. It says that the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish community, that is Arabs in Palestine, would have to be protected, that the Jewish national home should not impact negatively their rights. But the second caveat is that the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country should not be harmed. And this is in response to the concern by Edwin Montagu and other Jews in the UK, who thought very much like Schindler, that I just mentioned, Rabbi Schindler in the US, that the creation of some kind of Jewish national home, whatever that means, if it's a state or autonomy or a colony, that creates the risk of the reversal of emancipation. Now, I think what's interesting in that at this point, these two concerns do not seem to be linked. So the concern is not that what happens to Palestinians, the negative impact on Palestinians would then lead to the anti-Semitism against Jews in the diaspora. Seem to be two separate concerns. But they start to be linked during the British mandate in the interwar period. Firstly, there's the issue of Palestinians' uprisings, whether it's 1920, 21, 29, and 36, how to understand Palestinian anti-Zionism or Palestinian violence against Jews in Palestine, with the immediate, almost inevitable depiction of these events as pogroms, that is, in a kind of reproduction of anti-Semitic violence, while other people in the issue are saying, no, this is something else, this is national violence, or this is anti-colonial violence, depending who's speaking. The question of risks for diaspora Jews is another issue here. And here there's a fear that the dispossession of Palestinians would be used in Eastern Europe, say by anti-Semitic government in Poland, to justify their dispossession of Jews. And that comes across in, for example, Zev Jabotinsky's response to the suggestion in the 37, in the Peel Palestine Royal Commission, that Palestinians in the Galilee would be transferred, that is, ethnically cleansed, as to make way for the Jewish state. Jabotinsky is against that proposal because he thinks this is just going to be used then by Poland to, to expel its own Jews. It's a very dangerous precedent, and it's interesting. Jabotinsky later changed his mind during the Second World War, but about ethnic cleansing. But we don't have time to go on this. But the third issue is what happens to Jews in Arab countries, which are not at the forefront of Zionist discussion, I should say, but they are the ones that are actually feeling the effect of the concern or the struggle against Palestinian dispossession in Palestine, then involves attacks on Jewish communities in Egypt or in Iraq, elsewhere. And I'm talking about the, we see it already in the early 40s. So there is starting to be a link by what happens in Palestine is used to justify attacks on Jewish communities in these countries. But these concerns, I would say that the concern that Zionism is going to have a negative effect on the emancipated rights of diaspora Jews largely disappears after the Holocaust in the West, I should say. The Soviet bloc is something else. But in the West, that risk or that fear of British Jews that they would lose their citizenship or would be pushed to migrate to Palestine is something that kind of generally is not it does not seem to be a pressing issue in the same way that it was in the early 20th century. I come to the third moment and what we see now. So in 2023, so we have seen as part, in the last 2 months, as part of the whole responses to what's going on in Palestine, Israel, we've seen also attack on Jewish institutions that do not have an obvious link to Israel and do not, there's nothing that suggests that they support Israel, their extension Israel, whether it's a Yiddish center in New York or a Delhi in Los Angeles or the Vienna Holocaust Library, indeed, outside, just next to Birkbeck. And these and I think these are interesting as moments in which at a moment in which the Palestine issue has become central to anti-Zionist critiques and anti-Zionist concerns. Okay. So I'm going to say a number of observations as a kind of extended wrap up. And as I said, these are work in progress. These are things I'm continuing to think about it. So one thing is to say that, once that the prospect and reality of Jewish migration, settlements, and some sort of sovereignty in Palestine, Israel, becomes part of the agenda, it is clear that from the very beginning, that it would complicate debates on anti-Semitism. And we see this already in 1891, 5 years, as I said, before Herzl's Jewish state. Already then, this seems to tilt the discussion on anti-Semitism in Russia, in the US, into a new kind of frames of reference and a new kind of terminology with one set of people fearing that this will negatively impact on diaspora Jews, and others see that concern and unwillingness to support the project as a form of auto-anti-Semitism or whatever. So from the very beginning, the ability to differentiate and disentangle the issue of Zionism or the issue of settlement as Jewish sovereignty in Palestine from anti-Semitism in diaspora is very difficult, because these are things that are from the very beginning. Now, before the Holocaust, the Jewish debate on Zionism and its impact on the Jewish or the Jewish anti-Zionist debate, I think, and the concerns about the negative effect of the Zionism really was focused on diaspora Jews rather than on Palestinians. The issue of Arab Palestinians, what happens to them, is mentioned maybe as a marginal thing, but it's certainly not the main thing. The main reason that Jews put themselves against Zionism is because they fear that it will impact diaspora Jews' status. But since 48, because at least in Western countries, these concerns dissipated, the issue of Palestinian dispossession becomes the center of attention in Jewish anti-Zionist mobilizations. With anti-Zionist Jews see Israel's oppression of the Palestinian as something that negatively impacts their identity and their values. And in some cases, we don't see these concerns are not as harsh as we see in the early 20th century. So I'm struggling to find, anti-Zionists saying, Jewish anti-Zionists saying, Israel puts us at risk. I mean, I think we can find it, but we can find more of this discourse recently with people saying, when they see anti-Semitic attacks against Jewish institutions that have nothing to do with Israel, saying, well, the problem is Israel because Israel, by conflating diaspora Jews with Israel, is causing this. Basically saying that Israel is putting Jews at risk. While on the other hand, mainstream Jewish organizations, which see identification with Israel as a natural and understandable Jewish sentiment, argue that there is a certain continuum between violence against Israelis, as we've seen on the 7th of October, to violence against Jews, and equate both as forms of anti-Semitism. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you both, Camila and Yair. We have time for questions and discussion, and there are already some hands which have been raised. Anna Hajkova, first of all, please unmute yourself and make your point or raise your question.
Hi, David, it's Haikova, Hajkova.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so my question is to Camila, and thank you for the excellent paper. It's two questions. One is kind of methodological and one is more matter-wise. In most British universities, to my understanding, you need to have the express consent of people from social media who you are citing, at least at Warwick. And that puts us in a very difficult position. We need to have the consent of people I would call outrageous and anti-Semitic to cite them to show that they are outrageous and anti-Semitic. So like when people called me on Twitter a dirty Zionist, I would need to ask them, and I don't have it in me to write, and also assume they would not consent. So I'm not asking you if you ask these people for consent, but I think this is something that would be helpful to get changed, and I would love to hear your thoughts. And my matter question that I guess many people who listen today want to ask, you did such a fine job of showing the many problems of the decolonization debate. But I wonder, the anti-Semitism that opens his ugly mouth in all of that, is it coming, in your opinion, out of the core of the decolonization theory? Or is it more linked to the various anti-Semitic traditions that we have here? I mean, Simon Montefiore wrote this piece in The Atlantic that I think a lot of people read, and he said basically the problem is in decolonization theory. I thought the piece was useful, but went so far. But you are the expert on anti-Semitism and the left, so I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Camilla, would you like to answer now?
Yeah, or do you want to take a round? I don't mind coming back immediately, or...
Okay, thank you. Let's take a small round. We'll take two more. Davida Chani and then Martin Plaut.
Thank you. This has been very helpful, enlightening, and I've been struggling with how to address in some kind of public forum this rise in anti-Semitism, and I've been watching a number of these online seminars, and it seems to me that there are two approaches. One was mentioned a moment ago. One approach would be to stay within the terms of post-colonialism or decolonialism, and to flip the notion of who is the settler and who is the native. So in that direction, a couple of weeks ago, Chavatzelet Yahel from Ben Gurion University gave a paper in which she shows that you can make a very strong argument that it's Jews who meet all of the criteria for being the indigenous people in the land, the criteria set by the International Law Association. So that would be one approach. And then the other approach was raised in the previous question, which is to say that there is something wrong with the entire scholarly lens of post-colonialism, decolonialism, settler colonialism. And that approach has been taken by a scholar in Germany named Monika Albrecht, who has published, a book, an anthology on, I think it's called Post-Colonialism Cross-Examined, where she calls out the fact that Western colonialism is not the beginning of imperial oppression, and that there's something wrong with focusing on that form of colonialism as inherently more brutal in some sense than previous empires. And she doesn't make this point, but I would want to make the point that, what came before the British Mandate was the Ottoman Empire, which was an empire that was oppressive to Jews and other non-Islamic folks. So which of these approaches, I would love to hear people on the panel or others talk about the best strategy to take. Would it be to attack post-colonialism in itself, or to try and adopt its terms? Thank you.
Thank you, Davida. And Martin.
Thank you very much. And thank you to both the speakers. I think it is possible to over-conceptualize all of this. Certainly, having been active in the Labour Party for a long time, in fact, possibly 40 years and more, the far left was absolutely, on its knees until the Hamas attack took place. And suddenly everything came together for them. And for them, there's a very, very simple way of looking at all of this. The great Satan is the United States, as far as the far left is concerned, since they are the origins of all capitalism and capitalist plots. And the regional representative is Israel. And they simply link the two and say that this is all you really need to understand about this. And therefore you should be attacking Israel as a way of attacking international capitalism. And it doesn't really go much further than that. It doesn't require much more thinking about it. Now, of course, people then, find ways of dressing it all up. But it is part of an anti-imperialist struggle that the far left has been attempting to reconceptualize ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was a huge blow to them, of course, both in the Communist Party, but even in the Trotskyist left. But the Corbynists, and the militant tendency before them always had this kind of basic approach, which is that Israel is the handmaiden of America, America is the great Satan, and that's really what you need to do. So therefore, any opposition to Israel is an attack on the United States, and the attack on the United States is an attack on imperialism, and an attack on imperialism is a way to world revolution. It's really not very much more complex than that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Let's go back to Camila and Yair, and then I'm sure we'll have time for another round after that. Camila, would you like to go first?
Yeah, so thank you. In no particular order, I guess in terms of making sense where, I guess in part where decolonization is not a metaphor has come from. Certainly the work of Robert Miles, I think is very instructive here. Robert Miles wrote the Routledge Key Ideas book, originally published in 1989, in which he identified within the study of race and racism within this country, within the US, the dominance of a colonial model of racism. And he kind of traces that back to the 1960s and the influence of African-American civil rights struggles and a particular way of understanding racism within the US context that migrated into US academia and later crossed the Atlantic into UK academia. The issue with a colonial model of racism is that you then have the whole history of racism as it co-developed as a kind of mutual reflection of nationalism in Europe and then later elsewhere is banished. And then also the history of German fascism and the Holocaust is banished as well. So there's a quote from Miles paraphrasing him that says, you know, the consequences of the colonial model of racism is that anti-Semitism disappear. You know, anti-Semitism as a form of racism no longer exists. You don't see it, and Zionism enters the frame as a colonial racism. You also have 1967, the June 6 Day 1967 war, in which which was a turning point for much of the left on the question of Israel-Palestine. The influence of Stalinist anti-Zionism, particular kind of form of kind of left anti-Semitism, which if people want to know more about that, I'd recommend Daniel Randall's book on that. So I think there's a combination of a colonial model of racism, which on the left is very compatible with the Jewish question, with the idea that Jews are particularly harmful to humanity. Zionism becomes not just a form of racism, but the ultimately worst form of racism. Zionism is not just a colonialism, it's the worst manifestation of colonialism. In terms of how one could challenge some of the ideas that are coming out of, I guess, the post-colonial academic left, I think there is some debate already within this work, but in my book I talk about Maxine Rodinson, who was the pioneer of the concept of Israel as a colonial settler state. Rodinson was an Orientalist, he was an independent Marxist. He recognized Israel as a colonial settler state. He defined it, he analyzed it as such, but he drew different conclusions to the conclusions of much of the post-colonial academic left, in that he actually drew the conclusion of a two-nations, two-state settlement. So I would say his work is really important, and particularly the class politics that he infuses into his analysis, which is a good effort really to move away from, I think, the cultural essentialist identity politics that has kind of crept into analysis of Israel-Palestine. For now, I'm just conscious that I've maybe been talking for too long, so I'll hand over to the other presenter, Yair.
Yeah.
Yes, I'll say briefly. I think I'm a historian who uses settler colonialism as a concept, as a tool to think of the history of Palestine and Israel in the last century and in the present. I think, park the term on the side, you read Rabbi Schindler's article from 1891, there's not a lot of confusion or ambiguities. It's not very complicated. He says very clearly, you know, you expect millions, say 3 million of Jews or 6 million or whatever, to go to Palestine and push, and what's going to happen to the native population? Are they just going to lose their land and be pushed aside? And how do you expect them to react? And how do you think it's justified? Now, call it, you know, invasion, call it settler colonialism, call it, you know, whatever you want. But this is a process in which a group comes from the outside and it pushes the people that are already there. And that's kind of part of this. And again, settler colonialism is the form we usually refer to it. And that's not to say that, I mean, having said that, it's very simple and basic, that still the analysis has to go far, far more deeper, and to suggest a uniformity between settler colonial contexts is dubious, and to suggest that, and the current discourse on decolonization has many pitfalls that I think are really problematic. But the basic premise here, I think, is difficult to, especially as someone who works with early Zionist sources where the language is unambiguous. I think the question, I think the main thing also is that, you know, settlement is an ongoing Israeli practice. It's written into the nation state law. There is an effort now to establish settlements in North Gaza by various groups in Israel, which I think is quite possible that they will try to do it on the ground. So we're not doing ourselves any favors if we write off the settlement element out of this thing and continue with this thing. The second thing I would just say that I think it should be said that we can trace the kind of responses to 7th of October with a lot of pathologies. And I think in many of these responses, it's right to be very critical about the way that the cheering and so forth. But at the same time, you know, since probably more than 20,000 people have died, and most of them are women and children, and there is, you know, discourse within Israel by ministers and by various politicians, including government, that cannot be called as anything but genocidal. So I think the kind of concern and outrage are understandable. And also, I think the kind of concerns of people seeing the Chanukiah in Gaza and how does it reflect on Chanukiahs all over the world, I think that's a genuine concern that we have to grapple with, even if I think it's absolutely right to reject that conflation.
Thank you, Yair. I'll just say there are 4 hands which have been waiting for some time, and we'll take all of those and then get responses from Camila and Yair, and hopefully we will close a bit later than usual, but around about 2:15, just so that people know what the aim is. So questions or comments, first of all from Brendan McGeever, then Patrick Rogan, Gregory Uzalak, and then Daniel Randall. Brendan.
Hi, thanks, David, and thanks to Yair and Camila. It's nice to see you both and to listen to you both in this important session. My question is to Camila, actually, and it concerns the relationship that I think is implicit in your argument between this Tuck and Yang 2012 paper and the wider politics surrounding Israel-Palestine just now. I mean, the paper took as its center, your paper took as its centerpiece this 2012 intervention. But I thought in doing so, the paper didn't really, you only had 15 minutes, I acknowledge, but it didn't really engage with the long history of how pro-Palestinian liberation movements in Palestine have grappled with, conceptually, theoretically, and practically, the question of the future state, which of course long predates this academic article of 2012. So I wondered whether your paper implicitly reduced that long history to this scholarly article, which I think could be quite problematic, if so. And then secondly, there are a range of actors that I heard in your paper. There are movements for Palestinian liberation in Palestine at the political and everyday levels. There are academics here, leftists here, and I wondered whether the paper was implicitly rolling these actors into one and thereby building an elision into the main argument. I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, like, what are the terms of reference of this intervention? Like, what is it precisely that we are talking about when we talk about decolonization as a metaphor? And how can we show that that academic article, which has had 8,000 plus citations, has traction in the various context and for the various historical actors that you are dealing with in this paper? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brendan. Patrick, would you like to speak? Or you've placed a comment in the chat. Okay, for the moment, then let's move to Gregory Uzelak.
Hi there. Thank you for really interesting talks. I thought this was fantastic. I guess I want to try and keep it brief and give you something to work with, just to engage on more of a dialogue as opposed to specific analysis of your presentations. But I was wondering for both of you, maybe a little bit more, Camila, if you've observed this kind of interesting, I don't know, I guess I would call it a bit of a paradox that I've noticed in a bit of the discourse, particularly online, which we have to take with a grain of salt, where I find there are kind of two leftist camps, one of which is a more, let's say, traditional post-colonial, anti-colonial approach that is, I'm watering a lot of opinions down, but is essentially saying that Israel is a settler colonial state. It's illegitimate. Palestinians are the rightful owners to this nation state. But another interesting argument that I hear kind of picked and chosen when it shows itself is another form of that, which is that, and I can't really tell in my observation if it's a defense mechanism, if it's anti-Semitic, if it's something else, but it's the I don't believe in any nation states argument, which is a very interesting thing to engage with. I think it's full of some hypocrisies, but it's still very intriguing. It's particularly popular with younger people. And of course, coming out of metropolitan cities, mostly in the West. I'm based here in Australia, where the points of reference are very, very different to, say, New York City, where I'm from. But I do find that there's a little bit of a link that's uniting people through digital communities, where that is something that's fallen back upon, where to oversimplify it again, it's that Israel shouldn't be there, but also no one should be there, but the Palestinians should be there. And I was wondering if either of you have kind of observed that. I think there's a little bit of a link to what Yair, you were speaking about in those early anti-Zionist, non-Zionist kind of conversations as well, where recently Americanized Jews are kind of trying to fit into something that is not necessarily a nation state. It's still, the American identity is grappling with what it is at that period too. And so I was just kind of curious if any of that has kind of seeped into your research currently, particularly in this moment, and what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you, Gregory.
Thank you.
And lastly, Daniel.
Thanks, David, and thanks to both speakers whose work I find very valuable. I've got one question for each of you, but I'd be interested to hear both of you respond to both of them. So the question to Yair, which was sort of, I think, in kind of implicit in some of the thinking you're doing in this research, and I kind of feel like I know what I feel like the answer is, but I'd like to pose it to you, and I'm sure it's something you've kind of encountered as well. That, I've seen increasingly in discourse around the relationship between diaspora Jews and Israel, people say, I'm hyperbolizing slightly, but only slightly, people say, well, look, on the one hand, you want to tell us that you're not responsible.
That's why they couldn't hear me. There's a mute.
Sorry, I think some background noise, so someone was unmuted. The argument is, on the one hand, diaspora Jews, you want to insist that you're not responsible for what Israel does, and we shouldn't hold you kind of collectively responsible for its actions. But on the other hand, you want us to understand how you're all very deeply tied to Israel and the reasons why you might feel under attack when kind of Israel in toto is attacked. And this is completely unreasonable, and you can't have your cake and eat it, and you need to make up your mind. So might you respond to that, Yair? And is there a way of sort of disentangling these two facts, but also kind of holding them together? That diaspora Jews aren't collectively responsible for the actions of the Israeli state, but might also have ties to it that kind of need to be sort of considered in terms of a relationship. So that's the question to Yair. The question to Camila is about, I guess, the retreat from universalism into particularism that a lot of radical politics in general seems to have undergone. Because I think one could broadly say that left anti-colonialism of an earlier period, I won't specify which period because let's not narrow it down too much, but left anti-colonialism of an earlier period was part of a universalist project. That the opposition to colonialism was impelled by the desire to win a consistently democratic, egalitarian, socialist world, and opposition to colonialism was a sort of subset of the attempt to advance that project. It seems to me, certainly in what you describe as the post-colonial academic left, that there's been a retreat from universalism into a kind of particularism that basically gives up on any kind of universal horizon, which I would suggest necessarily would entail some kind of humanism. So it kind of gives up on a sort of humanist horizon as well, and retreats into a particularism that, all we can hope to do really is, the most radical thing you can aspire to is to kind of invert the existing structures of hegemony. So I wondered whether you might comment on that, but also, as I said, I'd be interested to hear both Yair and Camila respond to both questions if we have time. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Patrick, do you want to have another go? But please be brief because we're running short of time. No? Okay. So, Camila and Yair, I turn it over to you to sort of answer those very interesting, those extremely interesting points and questions, and to have the last words.
Yeah, okay, so I'll be brief. So coming back to Brendan, you're right. The presentation is unusual for me in that I agree that it takes some wider historicisation out, it takes some wider context out. I suppose what interests me was in that moment of the 7th of October and since, what is it about decolonisation is not a metaphor that for so many academics had traction, was the slogan that seemingly made sense. And when I refer to that set of ideas in the paper by Tuck and Yang, which is seen as an absolutely seminal paper within post-colonial studies, when I refer to it as a racialized identity politics of resentment, rage, and fantasized revenge, when you read the paper from 2012, it does read like a fantasy politics. And I think the images coming out of Israel on the 7th of October was seen as the fantasy becoming true, and the cheer or the silence when you go back to that paper is explainable. It's explainable through this kind of inverted racialization of Jews, Israeli Jews, into that settler camp that effectively makes them lesser human beings. So I guess that was, you know, very deliberately the narrative of the presentation. I really did want to go back to that paper to kind of think, well, why, where did this slogan come from? You know, how are these set of ideas being enacted on this day and then since? Totally agree with Daniel's comments. Although I would say there has been a retreat from universalism into particularism, but I would say that you know, many of the people I kind of work with or whose work I engage with wouldn't recognize that. I think it's a form of universalism, but that exceptionalizes the Jews. Says that you can be part of this universalist camp just so long as you subscribe to the full dissolution of Israel proper from the river to the sea. Okay, I'm going to hand over now to Yair.
Okay, so in terms of critiques that say that that comes out of denial of the nation state in general, so kind of anti-Zionism, and again, I should say anti-Zionism, I think is a problematic term because it's an umbrella term to quite a lot of distinct and importantly different factions and ideological positions. But I would have to see what you're talking about. For me, you know, if I think of anarchists who don't believe in nation states, they also don't believe in the identification of people with the regime that they happen to be born under, whether it's Israel or Hamas. So in that sense, that would suggest a universalist position that would stand against atrocities, whether it's bombing kids in Gaza or shooting at them in Nahal Oz or anywhere else in Israel. Okay, in terms of Daniel's question, I think that you know on the kind of tension between diaspora Jews not wanting to bear the responsibility of Israel because they're not citizens and claiming or insisting on certain connection there that exists and therefore impact. I think the issue is like, what is the claim? What is the second claim exactly? I think that's if you say Israel is part of my identity and therefore you can't say X because you said X on Israel and that kind of makes me upset, then I think it's difficult to it's a difficult proposition, and I think it kind of makes it much difficult to argue that Jews, diaspora Jews and Israel are two distinct things that shouldn't be conflated and shouldn't be blamed. That's not to say that it's a different thing to say that say Jews, because they are supportive of Israel, are free target, are a legitimate target, just because that wouldn't be legitimate. And I think that should be the kind of distinction between trying to kind of police discourse on Israel just because we don't agree with it, or we don't, and the kind of targeting of Jews that is uses connections to Israel as a kind of legitimation. And I think it's important to say that practically any Jewish organization and any Jewish group and any Jewish person in the world today can be seen as implicated with Israel. There can be some kind of connection that to be found that can be more convincing or less convincing. It can be more dubious or profound and robust. But I think there is a real risk there that once you say, his brother made Aliyah, or that synagogue hosted that speaker, etc. The question where you put the line is really a dangerous one, and therefore it seems to me that it's not a kind of objective criterion. It's whether the political project of opposing Israeli actions or whatever wants to make that distinction, then that this distinction has to be made robustly and distinctly, because if you start making these kind of loyalty tests, it's bound to end up with attacks on synagogues and these kind of things. It's almost inevitable, and that's where I see a real risk, and that demands, strategic thinking in this regard. Because I think that the risk is very real, that that basically diaspora Jews are seen as subsumed into Israel, and as a result of that, many of them, even if they don't support Israel, would end up kind of feeling that they have no other choice, that they're not given the possibility of being their own self. And I think I'll and on a universalist particulars, I mean, I think it's it's always interesting for me that the kind of the most effective forms of binationalism in Palestine, Israel, that are very consciously aware of different identities and how they play, are the ones coming from Marxist perspective. So you need the class struggle as a kind of dominant framework to be able to think constructively on binationalism, as not to erase it, that particularism, but to be able to think of it not as something that is subsumes everything. I'll stop here.
I'd like to conclude with some thanks. First of all, thank you to everyone for coming along today. I think there were over 130 people in the room at one point, and that's is testimony to the urgency of the subject. And I'd also like to especially thank those who raised questions and made points in the discussion. Above all, though, I would like to thank Camila and Yair for papers that were cogent, brave, and exploratory, and doing and speaking in a forum on this topic at this moment takes both a degree of cogency and bravery, and we are all in your debt for that. This is a discussion which will continue. It will continue in many places, but not least it will continue at BISA, and I look forward to seeing many of you on those occasions when we resume this discussion. Thank you all very much indeed.